After 2 emotional collapses in the AFC divisional playoffs, it seemed like the pressure was higher than ever before for the Buffalo Bills to finally reach the Super Bowl in 2023. Last offseason, it was pretty mixed for the Bills. They improved their offensive line, but they lost a few key players on their defense, and they still had one recovering from a major injury and a torn ACL. That player being Von Miller at edge rusher. So, pretty mixed bag, but nonetheless, the Bills were looking to finally overcome the hump that I'd been talking about last year in their season recap and the preview leading up to this season. So, the Bills were looking to finally get past the hump. That was the divisional playoffs, make it back to the AFC Championship game for the first time since 2020, and even further, for the first time in over 2 decades, the Super Bowl. So for the Bills, when you look at the positives for their season, it was that offensive line that they committed to last year in the offseason. So some of you may say, oh, they only added one notable person. That notable person being a guard from the Dallas Cowboys, Connor McGovern. Okay, fair point. But the protection for Josh Allen was, I'd say, slightly better. I mean, it's not the greatest in the world, but they gave him a little bit more time to throw. Maybe even more time to throw than the season or 2 prior. So the offensive line definitely gave him more time to throw, gave him more time to make a better decision or 2. So I'd say this offensive line, compared to last year's and the year after that, before that, much better than than the season, the last season prior. And then when you look at how the season ended for the Bills, it was definitely a better way for them to end the season than how the season prior, how the season like leading up to that was for them, if you know what I mean. In other words, it was not pretty. It was not pretty for the Bills because during that midseason stretch for Buffalo, it was very inconsistent, like extremely inconsistent throughout October and November during those dry periods because they had a lot of good and a lot of bad and a lot of ugly. So a lot of really weird inconsistency with the team that's supposed to have high hopes. And then they had a lot of high hopes of going to the playoffs, but unfortunately, those hopes were on life support by week 13 when they have their bye week. Those took an extreme hit when they lost in overtime to the Philadelphia Eagles on the road. So they had to regroup after that loss. They had a bye week, and then when they came back from that bye week, they turned it around, beat the Chiefs, beat the Cowboys, and sure, some of those wins weren't always in the prettiest of fashions. Like, for example, against the Patriots, a week before they had to face the Dolphins, but they managed to catch up to Miami and beat them in a winner-take-all game for the AFC East in the season finale. And rather than travel to face Kansas City in a rematch on the road in the playoffs, they went up all the way up to the number 2 seed and faced the Pittsburgh Steelers in the first round of the playoffs. So all things considered, they were the AFC East champions again and were the number 2 seed in the playoffs. Unfortunately, that's where pretty much everything went to shit for the Buffalo Bills, because when you look at this team, it was pretty flawed. It was very, very flawed throughout the season, because the reason why they were in this predicament from the midseason stretch onwards, because, well, they just shot themselves in the foot one too many times. It didn't have to be this way. Like I said, they were on the verge of missing the playoffs, 6-6, once they got to their week 13 bye week. And yeah, it's just how it was, though, because as is the case with the last 2 years, the coaching staff relied so much on Josh Allen to single-handedly carry this team all the way to the postseason that Josh Allen was just forcing everything under pressure, and especially those back-breaking turnovers that had been so prevalent in the last year, the last 2 years, and it just really hurt the team this year. And even with the change from Ken Dorsey at offensive coordinator to Joe Brady, it didn't really do much to neutralize that. You were still getting a turnover or two every single game from Josh Allen. And then looking at the defensive side of the ball, they didn't have edge rusher Von Miller for part of the season, and this defense was already like dealing with injuries like early on. They lost corner Tre'Davious White to a torn Achilles in week 4, and then defensive tackle Daquan Jones, and then linebacker Matt Milano was gone a week later. Jones was able to come back, but still, this defense was getting hit with a lot of injuries. So it was pretty brutal. It was pretty brutal. Then there's also some average to below average play from the secondary, like Micah Hyde, Jordan Boyer, Taylor Rapp, that back end middle of the defense. They've regressed in a big way. So this team, despite having a good quarterback and a solid supporting cast and some key playmakers on defense, there were a lot of flaws with this team, both talent wise and mentally. And then when you get to that divisional game against the Kansas City Chiefs, despite all their flaws, they had a really good opportunity to win that game against the Chiefs. But like I said, they just shot themselves one too many times in the foot. But there's a very big moment in that game where they did it at the worst possible moment. The Bills had several chances to beat the Chiefs in that game, especially in a 5-minute drive to close out that game. And to even tie the game, mind you. But yet, when they got to the red zone, Josh Allen just kept trying to go for the kill, trying to go for the touchdown, but he kept on missing every time. He was like 20 yards out, and he tried to go for a bomb, and he kept missing. And then you have to go kick a field goal. And rather than a couple plays earlier, you could have gone for a first down, but now you have to go for a field goal. The game's on the line, and you need it to go to overtime. But instead, everyone in the stadium, the Bills Mafia and Bills players are instead faced with two familiar words: wide right. Yes, those two infamous words back in their very first Super Bowl were once again faced with it in front of their own very eyes at home. Wide to the right. That's because Tyler Bass kicked a potential game-time field goal wide right, and the Bills couldn't stop the Chiefs afterwards, and their hopes of a Super Bowl once again went down the drain in the semifinals. So you look at the Bills of 2023, and despite the roster holes, despite the flaws, it didn't have to be this way. And it's just frustrating if you're a Bills fan. Josh Allen, once again, just put too much on himself. He tried to play hero ball in the divisional game, and not just even in that game, one too many times. And they paid the price for it. And, it's not entirely Josh Allen's fault, because coaching is to blame. Like, there were situations where they didn't even have to be in that point. So it was just a little surprising that after that game, they didn't make a change up at head coach with Sean McDermott to try and help Josh Allen and a roster that is going to look different if it didn't get the job done. So it's a little surprising, but it is what it is at this point. So when you look at the Buffalo Bills, it's just like, now that you get the job done for like the third straight year, it's like, are you gonna get the job done with this quarterback, with this roster that's now gonna look different as the offseason is underway? I don't know. So let's look at the offseason for the Buffalo Bills so far, because yeah, it's not pretty. They had around $42 million in the red, minus De Niro in debt. So they had no money to spend. They had to make some cost-cutting moves. But before all that, they had the 28th overall pick in this year's NFL draft. And they had some decisions to make at free agency, like receiver Gabe Davis, who unfortunately went to the Jaguars, edge rusher Leonard Floyd, they had to let him go to the 49ers, Tim Settle at defensive tackle, who signed with the Texans, Micah Hyde, who remains unsigned. So some of those cost-cutting moves for the Bills included Nyheim Hines, Mitch Morse at center, corners Ciron Neal, and Tre'Davious White, and safety Jordan Poyer, all whom signed with various different teams later on. So all of them became cap casualties. And even that wasn't enough to get them under the cap before the deadline a couple weeks prior. So once they did get under the cap, they did manage to sign a couple players like Curtis Samuel from the Commanders at receiver, Mike Edwards, the Chiefs safety, Falcons receiver Mac Hollins, and they did re-sign a couple of their own players as well. But still, there's still plenty of things that they need to address if they want to get back and competing and go even further than the divisional playoffs. Like, for example, they need a number 2 option long term alongside Stephon Diggs. Maybe Curtis Samuel can be that option, but the Bills should ideally use that first round pick to find a long-term deep threat to complement Diggs, because we all thought Gabe Davis was going to be that guy, but unfortunately he wasn't. He kind of disappointed this past year. He kind of was inconsistent. And then they need another edge rusher to replace Leonard Floyd. The Bills' pass rush was really lacking, with Von Miller struggling, coming off a torn ACL, and he's going to need some help now that Leonard Floyd's out in San Francisco. So maybe use one of those draft picks to draft another edge rusher to go alongside Von Miller. And then I don't know if it's a pressing need per se. Maybe it's a down year for him, but you got to consider looking into a kicker to compete with Tyler Bass, because did they really trust Tyler Bass in these big moments now, after falling victim to Wide Right, the sequel? So I'm just saying, like, maybe they should consider looking into the very late rounds of the draft, or maybe in later deeper into the offseason, to find a kicker in case of an emergency, in case Tyler Bass is continuing to struggle. Just pointing it out there. So the Buffalo Bills, they were once again hopeful to finally overcome the hump that was the divisional playoffs before the season started. They did win the AFC East despite all those rounds and glories, all those struggles. But unfortunately, they didn't. They didn't overcome the hump. And now they're paying the hard price for it for the first time under this regime, that is Josh Allen and Sean McDermott. Now, for Josh Allen, he's still going to have them competing next fall, but the rest of this offseason is just going to be telling of where the Bills lie in an AFC that's going to be, once again, really competitive this coming season.